Welcome to Moving Panels. I know this is not the normal voice you're used to hearing, but I'm Chad, and I'm here with Tim, and we've stolen the show for this week. We're going to give you a little one-shot, a little nerdy conversation, as Laramie says, about we're gonna hit up gritty versus colorful in the world of comics and movies. This is an ongoing discussion, how important it is for something to be quote-unquote realistic and real-world based and that sort of thing. So we're going to just walk through a few movies and kind of get to the bottom of this. So, Tim, what's your initial, before we start, discussing it and arguing it or whatever you want to call it, what's your initial feeling? Do you tend to lean towards gritty or colorful?
That is a great question, and something I've kind of thought about as preparing for this episode, and I'm not sure where I fall just yet. I think I have favorites on both sides, but I think it's a slightly an edge to the more colorful than the gritty, but I'm not an anti-gritty superhero fan. What about you?
Nice. Honestly, maybe I'm just trying to be the cool kid or something, but I kind of leaned towards gritty as a initial thought because I was just oh yeah, the Dark Knight and all those kinds of things. I was those are great movies, and I'm not sure now. I don't know that I would lean that hard one or the other. So
right.
It's interesting. We'll see.
Yeah, well, let's talk about a few.
Speaking of which, you want to start with gritty or colorful? I'll leave it up to you.
Let's start gritty. Let's go for let's start on the dark side and make our way to the light.
Nice. Well, I already mentioned it. I think the gold seal of approval, whatever you want to call it, the gold standard on gritty side of movies would probably be the Dark Knight Trilogy.
Yeah.
I mean, would you agree with that?
100%. Yeah.
And I love those movies.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I was a big fan. Let's go back, 80s flick flashback. Of course, I'm going to go back to the original 89 Batman, which kind of introduced the dark, more gritty side of Batman, different than the 60s.
Tim Burton's.
Yeah, different than the 60s, TV show that was much more cartoonish and more bright colors. You really got the Dark Knight, idea. But still had some color too. But yeah, Tim Burton's kind of a dark guy, so it had its nuances. But then when Nolan took over, I mean, he made it where it was dark and real. So it was much more grounded in reality and made you feel like, oh, this could really happen in a real city that I would, visit or live in, depending on where you are in the country. So yeah, I think Nolan tapped into something that we had not really seen in superhero movies before, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree with that. This is making me be very philosophical, to be honest with you, the more I thought about it. And not to dive too deep, and would you make this argument, I guess is a good question too, but would you, it's funny to me that we kind of automatically default to gritty is more, I'm making air quotes because you can't see me guys, is more realistic, real life. Yeah. That kind of thing. It's always viewed as the more real world thing. Nolan was trying to be super realistic. My world is not Christopher Nolan gritty. It's also not Christopher Nolan pretty, to be honest with you. I wish my life was filmed in IMAX, but
right.
but why do you have a theory on that? I've just been pondering what makes that the default to more quote realistic?
I'm going to somewhat disagree with you because I can think of things that are dark that aren't realistic. But I think Nolan was trying to merge those two things together. When I think we're going back,
I guess I'm meaning in popular culture,
right.
That was his reasoning.
He
was being more realistic.
Oh, yeah.
What's the default that makes gritty more realistic?
Yeah. And maybe that's
I don't know.
Maybe that's philosophical. Maybe the glass is half full for him. I mean, half empty for him, not half full as it is for us.
Maybe.
I don't know. Yeah, but he does, and that looking at his whole filmography, does he have a happy movie? Does he have a bright side to his storytelling? And I can't think of anything that I've been I left the theater I really feel really good about my life right now. I mean, they're all great. I mean, they're not all great, but most of them are great movies. And he has a great eye and is a great storyteller. But he's not a Steven Spielberg where I can get dark and gritty, or I can get on the little dark side, but still have some hope and some light and some humor added in as well. So maybe that's a story for another time.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's a fantastic comparison. I hadn't thought about Spielberg as kind of the other side of that coin.
Yeah.
Because I agree with you. I would argue that they're equally gifted storytellers, but yeah, you didn't you didn't see Memento and go, wow, I feel really good about life right now. You know, like
you're mesmerized by the storytelling and how he put a story together. Same thing with like Interstellar or my favorite is still Inception, and still a fantastic movie. Acting, direction, action sequences, but it's not even when that spinning top at the end is like, is it a happy ending or is it not? Yeah. So even when he plays,
lets you decide.
Even when he plays with the let's give you a happy ending, but is it? It's like you devil you.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Yeah, and they are the Dark Knight Trilogy is a very gritty series. Yeah. There's not a lot of color. There's not a lot of positive emotion. It's all very dark and brooding and all that sort of stuff. And there's very little variance from that. Mm-hmm. I would argue the first one is probably the most comic book like. Yeah. There are definitely shots in that where the panels, you're like, that could have been straight from one of the, more noir books. Mm-hmm. But as it went on, like, you definitely could tell he kind of went down the rabbit hole of like, how realistic can we get kind of thing.
Yeah, I agree with that. Well, let's move on to another movie or another series. I mean, Logan, which I know you and Laramie have recently discussed. I'll be honest, I was not a fan of Logan. And maybe because it was so dark, it left a bad taste in my mouth. So,
we discussed that in length. Me and Laramie do because that's one of my favorites. I think it's a brilliant movie. Yeah. But partly because I do have a connection to the comics with that one, even though, and obviously don't want to discuss that one too much considering we go in depth in it. Right. But it's kind of funny because it arguably has the least tenuous connection to the comics. Right. It's a very different movie. Yeah. That one worked for me. That movie I liked in the sense of it could be a kidnapping drama like Taken if you remove the superpowers. You almost don't need the superpowers in that one. That one just happens to be a Wolverine movie.
And I'm going to,
kind of thing.
With you saying that, I'm going to go ahead and tie that with another one that I was not a fan of, and that was Joker that came out a couple years ago. Yeah. And I've had the same thing to say. If it was not Joker, I would have liked that movie. But because it felt like it was trying to tell the flick story, not the Joker story. And if it was just about him as that person, I would have enjoyed it more. But because they tried to kind of shoehorn these comic book references into it, it didn't mesh well for me. And that's kind of different from our discussion about dark versus colorful. But those movies were trying to be dark, but I think because they didn't use the comic book elements, it lost some of that.
I think that's a very valid point in the conversation. If you're doing something just for doing it that way, it rarely works out in storytelling. Like they need to mesh well. Yeah, Joker, I have a love-hate relationship, and already on whatever you want to call it on the internet with my opinion on this one. I think it's a brilliantly made movie. I struggle with the fact that I kind of don't want a Joker origin story. Yeah. Like, not kind of, I don't. I do not want that story.
Yeah, I agree.
And yet it's so well done. Man, that one, you were talking about, Nolan movies, kind of leaving the theater. That one, I did not know how Laramie and I were going to record that episode because I got done watching it and I was just like, it was like punched in the gut. Yeah. And just sitting there like, well, that was super depressing, kind of thing. So it took a little while to get over the initial shock of that movie.
Yeah, I saw that one in the theater, like opening night or opening weekend, a packed theater, and that was one of the few movies where when it ended, it was just like nobody wanted to move. Like everybody was kind of like, I need to
I can
sit
imagine.
and kind of stir on this for a minute because I'm not sure I know what I just watched and how I feel about it. And you could hear kind of whispered conversations as people, like, nobody was like, you leave an Avengers movie, it was like, everybody's like, hey man, that was awesome. Everybody's like, rah, 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 talking, maybe the end of Infinity War might have been a close second where everybody was like, oh my God, what just happened? How am I gonna bounce back from this? They just killed Black Panther. What's gonna happen? Those kind of things. So, but yeah, it was a very interesting experience. And even me on the ride home was like, I've got to write a review for this, and I don't really know what I want to say because, well, like I said before, if it was just an Arthur Fleck movie, I would be giving it rave reviews. But as a Joker movie, I feel like it missed all the things that I wanted from all the things that I didn't want that it still didn't give me from a Joker. I'm something like you. I didn't need a Joker origin story. And so the mystery of how he became the Joker is what makes him the Joker, which makes him such a great villain. So I don't need to know why he became the way he is. So,
yeah. If you're going to just criticize, colorful versus gritty, I would probably argue that Joker is the grittiest of the spectrum.
I would agree with that.
Like that is a very dark movie. It gets almost too realistic.
Yeah.
There's definitely some like, man, we don't need to get into psychology this deep. This is painful.
Yeah.
Kind of stuff. Let's we've been hitting on all DC movies so far. Let's like spread out. Marvel is generally viewed as the more colorful one, that sort of thing, but they've got a couple of gritty films too. What did you think about Blade?
I love Blade. That's one of my favorites. And funny, I don't think of that as a Marvel movie, maybe because it's not MCU, which we're so accustomed to now. But but Blade is fantastic. I wouldn't say Blade 2 is great. Blade 3 should never have been made or released. But yeah, the first one is definitely great. But once again, it's dark, but it's still fun. It still has a way of being entertaining and dark at the same time, which maybe some of the other ones don't do as well.
Okay, so let me throw out a weird question. Since you brought up Blade Trinity. So does that movie not work because it's a gritty movie that you decided to insert the pretty people into? And I don't mean that like derogatorily, but it was like, let's get Ryan Reynolds and Jessica Alba on board with this.
I think it was just, I don't think it's solely that. I think it was just uneven in so many different ways. Like it was an unnecessary sequel in the sense of, like most sequels, no, but it was like, it wasn't a Blade movie anymore. Like it felt like, and if you know the backstory, which I haven't dug deep, but I've read some things, especially recently, about how Wesley Snipes did not want to do the movie and was very adamant about not wanting to be in the movie.
Out, yeah.
So it was like they were trying to build these other characters to kind of show less of him. So then it became, is this a Blade movie or is this Ryan Reynolds and was it Jessica Alba or Jessica Biel?
Oh yeah, you're right.
Okay, Jessica Biel. Sorry, you said it. And so
I'm getting my late '90s
Jessica's
mixed
there were so
up.
many
Sorry.
back then. Simpson, yeah. There were a lot of Jessicas in the '90s. So I don't think it was adding the humor that hurt it as much as just not knowing. It was just an uneven story, an uneven put together. So, but the comedy didn't help either, and that was before everybody loved Ryan Reynolds' type of humor as well. So he hadn't he hadn't really won over our hearts at that point, where he was just more annoying than he was funny.
Yeah. But back to the original Blade. Yeah. I think you could make the argument that it's one of the best Marvel movies.
Oh yeah.
And it doesn't get the MCU credit that it probably deserves. And for that matter, like it was key in spawning comic book movies again. There had been a long hiatus since really anything had been done until Blade was done. I think that this one is arguably kind of a phone-in on the gritty aspect. Mm-hmm. It's a vampire movie.
Yeah.
Like it is, of all the things we've talked about, probably the easiest thing to just go, yep, this one should be dark and brooding, because that's the whole genre,
Right.
So I don't know if that one counts. So the other side of the Marvel coin is the Fantastic Four, the 2015 version. they decided to go pretty dark with this one, especially on the off-world stuff. What was your take on that movie?
Once again, once again, knowing the backstory with this one, I loved the first probably 45 minutes to first hour of that movie, and then the ending just completely lost me. And from what I understand, the director felt like the studio took over and he didn't get to make the movie he wanted to. Yeah. I definitely enjoyed it more than the original Fantastic Four movies that came out in the early 2000s.
Sure.
But, I mean, I think if that one had been executed the way the director wanted it to, based on how it started, I think it would have done much better, and I would have liked it more.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Like, the first 2 acts are probably good. Like, it's a good setup. You kind of appreciate how they decided to tell a different Doctor Doom story. You change that up a little bit. So it had elements going for it, and then just unravels. And I mean, it had everything it needed. So maybe you're right on the director portion, but I mean, the casting was good. I mean, come on, like, that's a great cast. It had a lot going for it, and then just like slowly undid itself. So, but did it make a difference to you, gritty versus non-gritty? So was it an attractive movie in the sense that gritty, quote unquote, real worldism made it interesting versus the previous takes on Fantastic Four, which were a little more colorful and comic booky?
Yeah.
Like, I think that's an interesting one to compare.
Yeah, I think, if I compare the two together, I think I honestly, even though it fell apart at the end, I prefer the newer incarnation of Fantastic Four. And once again, maybe not so much colorful versus dark as much as just tone, which I guess colorful and dark is kind of a tone if we're saying that. As I'm convincing myself as I'm talking, just tonally, it kind of knew what it wanted to be. I think the original Fantastic Four didn't know what kind of tone to take. Kind of a lot like some of the more cartoonish superhero movies that we've had. But I was going to ask this question as we're having this discussion. Maybe this is the discussion we should be having. Which is harder to make and be successful? A dark and brooding or a colorful one? And it seems to me like the dark and brooding is harder to pull off because you have to find that balance. Where I think the colorful, which it doesn't always work either, tends to has a more established pattern. I hate to say it, cookie cutter formula that you can follow that kind of makes it work a little easier than trying to take risks and do something different with a dark and brooding one. Would you agree with that?
No, that's interesting. No, now I kind of want to continue with the conversation almost with that in mind, you know?
Yeah.
With that idea, like, let's switch to the colorful movies and just kind of see if that sort of adds up for us. I think that since we're on Marvel, I think the gold standard, if the Dark Knight Trilogy is the gold standard on the gritty side, I think the Avengers movies would be the gold standard on the flip side.
I agree.
So let's just start with that. So the Avengers, much, much, much brighter take.
Yes.
The Hulk is literally vibrant green. You know, it's like, So just character-wise, it's a much, much brighter movie. And I think that almost begs the question, do ensembles work better as colorful films versus a solo set? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know either. But as far as just thinking about the Avengers as a whole, they got better as they went on. And I think Laramie and I've talked about this before, where the first Avengers was great at the time, but then as the movies evolved and you go back and watch it, it is still very cartoonish and not quite as even in tone as when the Russo brothers took over with,
for sure,
when they kind of took over from the Captain America movies. So yeah, and then ensemble, that's a lot to chew on and think about.
Well, so we've been talking about directors a lot. Joss Whedon famously did the first one and then Age of Ultron. And I'm one of the ones that's in the camp that Age of Ultron is a better movie than it gets credit for being. Yeah. And everybody kind of knew that it was a middle movie. So, it was, I feel like people were asking too much of the film, and if you just watch it on its own, it's not a bad superhero movie. It introduces some important elements that they build on, the whole Sokovia thing, all that sort of stuff. But those two movies, like you're saying, clearly are kind of the toddler phase of the franchise, if you will. But I still think they hold up. For bright, colorful movies, they could deal with dark, gritty things. I mean, the whole Sokovia thing.
Right. I was going to say, when you think about even with those two, I remember in my review of Age of Ultron back when I was doing more reviews, I talked about how dark Age of Ultron was compared to all the other Marvel movies up to that point.
Yeah.
Even the Dark World, maybe. Let's not talk about that one though.
Yeah.
But yeah, with the with the Scarlet Witch and those kind of getting into the mystical powers and stuff, it did lean more on that dark edge, but it was still bright and colorful. But it still kind of played with that a little bit
emotionally. Yeah. 100% agree with you. Yeah, and got far more real world in its themes in a very literal way. It dealt with real world international politics and all this sort of stuff. So you're absolutely right in that. For me, it works. I mean, I like the colorful take on the Avengers. If they had tried, it's very difficult for me to imagine a world in which you made the Avengers and it was a dark, gritty movie. Yeah. That does not lend itself to noir filmmaking. So I don't know that one would have worked even if you had brightened it up.
I hate to jump back into DC world, but since we bring up Joss Whedon, I guess we kind of have to talk about the different Justice Leagues, because the Joss Whedon Justice League tried to bring that bright and colorful world to a dark story that Zack Snyder had begun with Man of Steel and Batman v Superman. And then when he was able to give his full version of the Zack Snyder cut, you really got two completely different movies. And we all agreed that the darker version was better. But I think this goes back to this goes back to the director. He knew what he wanted. He knew the tone that he was already setting, and I think that's why the original the Joss Whedon Justice League felt so wrong, because it aborted the tone that was already set by the two movies leading up to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were talking about gritty directors. I don't know that Zack Snyder understands colors. He is a dark and brooding dude.
He wants his movies in black and white. Like, he shot Justice League to be in black and white. So, and we kind of talked about Nolan, but I think Snyder just, he might be the top of the list as far as dark and brooding.
Well, he might be more dark and brooding. I don't know if he makes better movies. I'll just leave it at that. So. Yeah,
that is true. Touche, my friend.
So,
touche.
Not that I dislike Zack Snyder. That whole project had its issues, and man, that is an interesting point, though. I hadn't thought about that, but I remember thinking at the time, even like, these two dudes have very different storytelling styles. Joss Whedon is not incapable of getting dark and gritty. I mean, he did Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which can be dark, but it's like campy dark. Right.
He knew how to add humor and lightness. Once again, let's go back to like something like The Joker or like Logan. Those are not funny movies. There's not a whole lot of humor you can add into those movies to lighten the tone. They're going all the way dark. Yeah, so I think we're kind of talking. I think this has become more of a director's discussion than a colorful versus light discussion. Well, I mean, which rightfully so. Yeah. But some directors know how to, or some directors know what they want to do, and some that don't, or can't find that right balance of dark and brooding with some light attached to it. So
we couldn't talk about this on Laramie's podcast, even though we took over and he's not here. You can't mention the bright and colorful movies on the superhero genre without bringing up Christopher Reeve's Superman.
Of course. he would not allow. He would make us re-record this entire episode if we didn't. So yeah, and that's once again, and I would say those are the gold standard, even more so than the Marvel Cinematic Universe as bright and colorful superhero movies, because it jump started so much. And it had to be because Tim Burton's Batman was almost. I'm not going to do the super shiny, super bright superhero movie. I'm going the exact opposite direction with his version of Batman. So
yeah, to be fair though, Batman's never been a bright, shiny character. I mean, so that even in the comic books, you go way back, and that's true. You have very bright and all daytime panels in Superman comics, and you have all
nighttime
dark detective nighttime stuff going on with Batman. Yeah. So nothing's better than the Caped Crusader sitting on top of a building with the rain pouring, and flip side is nothing is cooler than Superman flying through a bright cloud in the middle. It's those characters do that too. But yes. I don't know. So I'm going to throw a gauntlet down since Laramie's not here. I'm going to have to do an episode with him one day. I kind of disagree with Laramie. I don't think the Chris Reeves movies started comic book movies in the sense of like what we have today. I think it was kind of an interesting one-off because you don't have much made after the Superman movies. But that neither here nor there. They still are superhero movies, comic book movies. And they are bright, shiny, beautiful movies, even when things are going poorly. The Hoover Dam is busting, and it's still bright. Yeah. It's a bright, beautiful scene. So, how do those movies? It's almost unfair to compare them with everything we've been talking about that were made, circa the 2000s. Yeah. But does that work for you? As a colorful film.
Yeah, I think it does. And you look at it in comparison with, well, once again, Zack Snyder's Man of Steel, where it was much a darker version of a Superman story. Darker hues to the suit. I mean, even a darker, somewhat of a story of his upbringing and that kind of thing. Or not his upbringing was terrible, but just he kind of told a bit more of a story with, Mom and Pa Kent, but I lost my train of thought now.
Well, I think that's an interesting film to look at from what you're talking about too, because my favorite parts of that movie are the bright parts. Because he did do some stuff. The bus scene is brilliant to me, like the glaring sun off the water and all that sort of stuff. And so when Zack Snyder decides to put on his color hat and do a little compare and contrast. He makes some really, really beautiful setups. Oh, yeah. And so parts of that movie, to your point, I think the parts of that movie that work the best for me are when it's bright. And, I mean, come on, let's be honest. That is Superman. Yeah. Superman is intended to be, inspirational, not a dark and in the shadows character, which of course is why Justice League type stuff, Batman and Superman together, is so interesting, because you have your polar opposite philosophical views on how to fight evil. So that's what makes it interesting. But yeah, the Chris Reeve movies, I mean, I don't see where you can critique them. No. Well, I mean, the first one. We'll say the first two, maybe. That they obviously got campier and campier, and so if you were going to do like a case study on colorful versus gritty, I think that would be an interesting one to do, because they lean too hard into colorful. It gets silly. But the first movie is a masterpiece.
And then going back to, if you want to go back and listen to us talk in depth about Superman 1 and 2, Laramie and I have both done those episodes, so feel free to jump back and listen to those. But, Superman was itself, it became uneven as it went on, because no one had ever done that before. Just like you said, there weren't any other movies at that time, because I don't know if they just were afraid to touch it, but you also had the TV shows going on at the same time. You had Incredible Hulk was on TV. They had tried to do Spider-Man on TV. Maybe just a special effects. They didn't have. That was such big budget money to spend for special effects, and of course they got worse as the franchise went on. But that's its own behind the scenes story with the producers and all that kind of stuff. But
Yeah.
you know, you're right. It really wasn't until Batman '89 that another superhero movie was made on that level. So, and once again, kind of back to the same thing. Superman 1 and 2, super bright, colorful, blockbuster movies. Even 3 was a blockbuster, even though it wasn't as good of a movie. And then The Dark Knight, which was, Batman, Tim Burton's Batman, which was much darker in tone and, you know, different character, still made a buttload of money. So they both work. They both work when they're done well.
Yeah.
And I think that we're talking about. If it's done well, whether it's dark and brooding or it's bright and colorful, we just want a great comic book movie more than we want. I think that's kind of what we've said, kind of going, you know, that was our thought at the beginning is we just want a great superhero movie, whether it's dark and brooding or not. I don't think that's going to, I don't think one turns me off more than the other. Like, I'm going to watch it either way. I just want to see a great superhero movie adapted from a great comic.
Yeah. And I think you've alluded to this a couple of times, that probably the best of the best kind of falls somewhere in the middle and deal with both well.
Yeah.
So you brought up Batman 1989 several times. I kind of would argue that it's one of those that kind of strides in both worlds. It does have some humor elements. Yep. I mean, come on, the casting of Bruce Wayne Batman was genius. Yeah. Tim Burton is, I mean, come on, he's a Hall of Fame director, if that were a thing. Yeah. And so, you know, he knows what he's doing, but you know, he got so much criticism for that when he cast Michael Keaton as Batman, and he was so good. And I think that's part of it. To your point, I think that having a guy who could walk that line, who could be funny and add some comedy, but also kind of had a dark edge to him a little bit, you know, that really works for that movie. Even though, you know, obviously the literal tone of that movie is pretty dark, but there's still some color elements. The bright yellow badge on his chest. You know, when you get to Zack Snyder, it's a bizarre, different color gray bat that's integrated into the suit. It's not this like bright, iconic visual that you have in that movie. So they're definitely, and the Joker. I mean, that he is very bright and colorful character. Yeah,
exactly. And it's funny because you say that because it's almost. There's the yin and yang of that movie. You know, Batman is the dark. It kind of flips it on its ear where, you know, the good guy always wears white and the bad guy always wears black. And here you've got that, you know, put on its head where Batman is the one in all black with the yellow symbol. And then you've got the Joker who's white-faced and, you know, purple and green, you know, suit and, you know, bright colors. Like, wait, who's the bad guy? Who's the good guy here?
Spraying acid from a flower on his lapel, you know, it's a very interesting movie. No, that and clearly, at least to people of our age, it clearly works really well. It's one of my favorite movies. Guardians of the Galaxy, man, we just keep going back to directors, but James Gunn. I would argue that James Gunn is also one of the ones that bridges that the best. Like, he clearly has kind of a darker sensibility overall, but he understands how to play with color and humor.
I was going to say to exactly to your point, the new Suicide Squad is very dark in its humor and its tone and its violence, but it's one of the brightest colored movies you would see. I mean, he's just it's exploding with color. And it's almost like, once again, the directors are saying, you know, oh, you think you got us figured out? Here, let me show you what I can do. I can give you this dark, you know, this dark movie about villains who are going to be superheroes, and I'm going to put them all in the brightest colors you can think of and make them look bright and shiny to just kind of mess with your mind anyway. So, because I can't think of Guardians of the Galaxy as being bright or dark. I think it is a good mix of the two together, which is probably why I love it so much. One of my favorite Marvel movies, because it has that. It's so well balanced with the humor and the dark and the tone and everything all together.
Well, and I mean, this is not some eye-opening take or anything, but you know, and the music he does, he James Gunn is such a good storyteller of texture and building a emotional universe. And I mean, there were a handful of us who knew what the Guardians of the Galaxy were. They weren't exactly a super successful comic book.
Right.
So, I can remember having a conversation with Laramie about that, and I'm more of the Marvel guy, so I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, but I knew who the Guardians were at least, and he was kind of like, yeah, I very vaguely know this Star-Lord guy, kind of thing. And then, like you're saying, arguably the best of the Marvel movies up until that point, for sure. Yeah. Like it's such a well-made film,
especially for, like you said, for an ensemble film that for the characters that nobody really knew anything about, to win over audiences as easily as it did is saying something for the director and the writing and the team and the actors. I mean, it was perfectly cast, even down to Rocket Raccoon being voiced by Bradley Cooper, which is still one of my favorite performances. That's just kudos to them to be able to do that.
So this might be a little more controversial of a take, but I would say that the 2000 X-Men is one of the ones that walks the line very well. Whether you care for the movie in hindsight, if it holds up or not, I think they did a good job of trying to make it realistic but not going too dark. I mean, they even joke about that. The whole thing about Wolverine's like, I'm not wearing that costume kind of thing. Yeah. And so they decided to have a literally real world aesthetic. Like they're dressed in kind of leather biker gear that you could argue would be mildly protective, in a fight kind of thing. So yeah. But I personally feel like that movie works well as one that walks the line between dark and gritty.
I agree, and I would say even that franchise, or the beginning parts of that franchise, did that really well. I would agree with that. Yeah. I'm a big fan of the first three. I know me and Liam are going to have that conversation about X-Men 3 because I'm actually a fan of The Last Stand. I don't think it's a perfect movie, but people tend to harp on it more than I think it deserves, in my opinion. But
I would agree with that. Yeah. It has its plot holes and stuff, and unfortunately,
as every X-Men movie has done. So
yeah, for sure. Not to go too deep into that one, but I think the problem with X3 is it was too conclusive. So everything they made after X3, they had to just negate stuff that happened in that movie because it literally killed too many characters and that sort of thing. So yeah, but I think that franchise holds up to what we're talking about. It's a blend of gritty and real, quote unquote, real world and colorful, playful otherworld aesthetic. Because again, like back to my weird philosophical point at the beginning, like I don't understand what it is that like gritty is the default for quote unquote real world, and when you make shiny, bright, beautiful movies, somehow that doesn't seem set in reality. It pulls it into this, and I mean, you have brilliant, well, not to get way off topic, but you have brilliant other genre movies that do that well. I mean, Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, like stuff that plays with the idea that we're talking about. But it's very interesting to me that you would look at Chris Reeves' Superman, and that's a less real world movie than the Dark Knight trilogy. I'm like, my world isn't all in gray tone, So I think that's a really, really interesting thing.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think, I think you can be bright and still be grounded in reality just as much as you can be grounded in reality with Dark and Brooding. And once again, I think it's just perspective. I think it's kind of how that director, sees the world, more or less. At least that's my thought, anyway.
So we've solved this problem. It's all down to direction. We just blame the director, and for good or bad, right?
For today, at least. we may change our mind in a couple hours. We'll call each other later and be like, man, I totally blew it. No, it's this. This is the key. Yeah.
I don't know. I think there's definitely something to be said in the fact that was the default for both of us as we discussed this was, Chris Nolan, that's how he makes movies. Zack Snyder, that is how he makes
Yeah.
movies, that sort of thing. And it seems like the best of the best blend it to varying levels, at least,
Yeah.
So
Balance is key.
man.
Balance is balance. As
Yeah.
as Thanos taught us, balance is key.
Nice. Awesome callback. Yeah, man, what a great conversation. I would have thrown 1989 Batman like squarely into the gritty camp, but the more we talked about it, like that is a brighter movie than you remember.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. So that's really, it's been a fascinating conversation.
Yeah.
Well, I've been stealing the show as the stand-in. Do you want to close us out here,
I
Tim?
definitely will. Thanks everybody for listening to this one shot of Moving Panels. Definitely follow Moving Panels on your social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. And until next time, for Laramie, Chad, and myself, we'll see you guys on the other side of the page. Do you love movies of a certain age? Do you miss the days of VHS tapes and VCRs and video rental stores? Is the thought of another 80s movie being remade seem inconceivable? If you want to go back to school, back to the future, or even back to the beach, then the 80s Flick Flashback Podcast is for you. I'm Tim Williams, the creator and host, and on each episode, I'm joined by a guest co-host as we revisit a different 80s flick to discuss our first-time watch memories, iconic scenes, and even learn some behind-the-scenes stories along the way. New episodes drop every other Friday on your favorite podcasting platform. So make like a tree, get out of here, and go listen to an episode of the 80s Flick Flashback Podcast.